Ek staan vandag in die Bainskloof pas tussen Wellington en Ceres in die Weskaap op 22 April 1997 as Shawn Lategan en Maritza van Merwe, 'n jong verliefde paartjie van Mamasbury, wreed vermoor in hierdie einste pas.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me here again today. Last week we did something different and we spoke about some of the top 3 most disturbing missing people or persons cases that I have ever read. But today we are going back to a South African double murder. So this story I actually accidentally found when I was busy looking through old photos on my phone, and I actually just Googled whether these places were still open or not, during these times. And this was a murder that took place quite close to where I used to holiday as a kid and during my younger years. And this took place in an area called Bainskloof. And for me, Bainskloof was never a place where I felt uncomfortable or unsafe, except when it came to baboons. I will never feel safe or happy in the presence of them at all. I find them absolutely terrifying. But besides that, Bainskloof was always a very happy place and a happy memory for me. And that's why hearing what happened to this couple was so terrifying and so shocking. So that being said, today we are going to talk about the Bainskloof murders. And this is a whirlwind of a story. So if you would like to hear about how being in the wrong place at the wrong time really is one of the worst things that could happen to you, then let's get into it.
Intended for mature audiences only.
So in high school, I did take history as one of my courses, and I thought I would just give a little history of Bainskloof while we at it. So Bainskloof Pass was created in September of 1853, and this was one of the busiest places where travelers would go to reach the northern parts of South Africa until other roads were built around 100 years later. And the reason that Bainskloof has its name is because of this guy. His name was Andrew Bain, and he was born in June of 1797 in one of my favorite places, Scotland. But Andrew Bain came to the Cape and worked his way up to being a master builder of roads. And without getting too much in the history of the Cape and what happened here back then, I'm just giving you the very, very basics of how Bainskloof came to exist. So overall, it's just a very old pass, basically. Also, the Bainskloof Pass is listed as a South African National Heritage Site and is located in the Western Cape. So let's actually get into today's story. And all over the world, I'm sure we all experienced it, where we have those men or women who hang around on like building corners or street corners, and they're just kind of looking around, looking to cause trouble. And sadly, in South Africa, we are definitely not excluded from this. We definitely have a lot of people who try and cause trouble. But on April 23rd, 1997, 5 troublemakers would change the fate of a couple for no good reason. On the night of the 23rd of April, 1997, 5 frames were hanging around a parking lot near a fish and chip shop in a quiet little town called Mamasbury, which is in the Western Cape in South Africa. It's a beautiful place, but that's not the point. The point is that there were 5 men: Donovan Crichter, Andrew April, Ricardo Futter, Percy Whittles, and Ruben Hector. And to start off, Donovan Crichter, who was kind of the leader of this group, he was no stranger to the police in South Africa. He actually left a place in Cape Town called Esterrivier because he was involved in a robbery in Merwe, so he had to escape to some family in other areas of the Western Cape, which is why he landed up in Mamasbury. Andrew April was actually a suspended cop at the time, and the rest were just all troublemakers in their own rights as well. So remember I said that these 5 were hanging around a car park? Well, they weren't just hanging around, they were looking for trouble. They decided that they were going to rob this fish and chip shop because it was open really late, and they thought that they could wait until it was just about to close and the tills would be full of money. And how they were going to do this was they decided that they were going to take Donovan's shotgun and Andrew April's service weapon. Now remember, Andrew April was a cop and he was suspended. So why he still had his service weapon, I have no idea. They also decided that they weren't just going to attack this fish and chip shop. They also wanted to go to other places around the area, other towns, to rob them as well, because they wanted to make as much money as they could that night. But then everything took a turn when a young couple pulled into the same parking lot that these 5 men were in. So they see this car kind of pull in and park on the other side of the parking lot, actually by the front entrance of this fish and chip shop. So now Donovan and Ricardo are kind of looking at this car, wondering who they are and what they're actually doing there. But obviously there was a fish and chip shop there. They parked outside the door. They were going to get fish and chips. So before Donovan and Ricardo decided to go over to this couple, they actually had like a little group chat, and they decided that they were going to hijack this couple and take their car so that they could use their car for the robberies and throw the police off. And after they had taken the car, they were just going to leave the couple on the side of a road and let them get on with whatever they needed to do. So, like I said, Ricardo and Donovan started walking towards this couple in the car. And Donovan walks to the side of the driver's side, and Ricardo walks to the side of the passenger side. And Donovan opens the door, and he takes the gentleman who's sitting in the driver's side by the neck and tells him to get out of the car. Then Ricardo walks over to the lady who's sitting in the passenger side, and he kind of puts his hand over her mouth and tells her to like shut up, basically. But he's trying to keep her quiet. Donovan and Ricardo then get into the front and passenger side and tell the couple to get into the back. Ricardo then signals out of the window that the other guys in the other car should follow them to wherever they're going to go next. So the men then drove around the mountain passes around the area, I assume to decide what to do with the couple, or to figure out what to rob next, or what nonsense they were going to get into next. And I'm not sure if it was because the gentleman who was in the back seat was petrified and he started begging to let them go, if that's why the table started turning. But the plan to just leave them on the side of the road and for them to get on with whatever they needed to do kind of fell to the wayside, and the guys now decided that they were going to keep the couple as hostages, basically. Now, before I continue and we get into the gruesome acts of torture that are going to unravel themselves in this case, I do want to put a face and name to the couple who were in the car. The man who was kidnapped was named Shawn Lategan, and he was around 19 years old at the time. Shawn had 2 siblings. He was very quiet. He was a very well-behaved young man, and he was just obsessed with cars. He loved cars. So when he was old enough, he left matric, he turned 18, he decided that he was going to save enough to get his own car. So he did, and he saved up enough to get a Ford Laser. And not only did he get the Ford Laser as a car, he also saved enough to get one of those like heavy sound systems at the back of the car, where you kind of like have your windows vibrating the whole time that you're playing music, like that kind of sound system. But he was happy. This is everything he worked for, and this was his like baby. And then the woman who was in the passenger side of the vehicle, her name was Maritza van der Merwe. She was almost 22 years old at the time, like a couple weeks before turning 22. She also had 2 siblings, and Maritza was very, very passionate about modeling. She loved beautiful things, beautiful people, and she was determined to be a model when she was older. But, you know, life happens, and she had to unfortunately get like a normal job, and she became an admin clerk for a company that was near her area. Both Shawn and Maritza lived in Malmesbury, and they were actually very good friends who ended up dating. Like I said, Shawn and Maritza had known each other for yonks, and they decided one day for their date that they were going to go out in Shawn's car, and they would just drive around and listen to music. Then on the 23rd of April 1997, the day that they wanted to go out on a date to listen to music, Maritza was actually working that day. I think it was a Tuesday or Wednesday. And she called her mom up to say, you know, can you make my favorite food? I'll be home later, but I'm going out with Shawn and I'll be back later. Maritza's mom was like, okay, cool. I'll make the food and I'll see you later. So Maritza went home, picked up a jersey, and then left the house because Shawn was waiting outside in his car. So Shawn and Maritza then decided to drive around Malmesbury. They were going around all these mountain passes, looking at beautiful scenery, listening to music, and just having a really romantic drive around these beautiful passes. But then it got dark, and they, you know, they were done being romantic and socializing with other people, and they decided that it was time for some food. They were actually hungry, and it was around 10 p.m. that night. And that's how Shawn's car ended up in the same parking lot as Donovan and these 4 other men. So now that you know who this couple was in the car, let's get back into the story of what actually happened to Shawn and Maritza. So like I said, Donovan and Ricardo were in Shawn's car, and they were driving around this pass. Eventually, both vehicles stopped, and all the men got out of the car with Shawn and Maritza still in the car. Then after the guys were finished chatting, they pulled Shawn and Maritza out of the car. They then duct taped their hands together, and they made them stand on the side of the road. The men kind of started having fun with Shawn. They were hitting him, punching him, and then after Maritza had seen all of this, they then shoved both of them into the boot of Shawn's car. Donovan and Ricardo got back into Shawn's car, and the other 3 men drove in the other car. And they drove around the Boerland area, around different mountain passes. They went from Worcester to Ceres. So eventually, after driving for a while, I'm sure that Shawn and Maritza must have been panicking the whole time while in this boot. It's dark, they don't know where they're going, they're just feeling bumps and being thrown around the boot. But eventually they stopped. The boot opens, Donovan and Ricardo pull both of them out of the boot, and one of the men, Percy, pulls a gun out, points it at Shawn, and Shawn is obviously panicked. He's terrified of this, and he starts running. The men then all just stand and laugh at him, and then they let him run for a little bit, and apparently some of these guys are really fast, and they ran after Shawn and then kind of kicked his feet, and he fell face first on the ground, and they then didn't even bother picking him up. They then dragged him all the way back to the car on gravel, and it's just, that's painful enough. So now all of the men stood around Maritza and Shawn, who were now sitting on the floor with like a circle of guys around them, and they were having a discussion of what they would do in front of Maritza and Shawn. They were talking about whether they should kill them, whether they should torture them more, those kind of things they were having in front of them. And remember, I told you that Andrew April was a suspended cop, and he suggested in his wisdom that they shouldn't shoot them because these echoes could really travel quite far, especially in these passes with people around them. Noise travels fast in like silence. And then Donovan said that because both Maritza and Shawn had seen their faces, they needed to be dealt with and they couldn't survive. So Ricardo then started hitting Shawn in the face, as well as in the stomach and in the chest. And apparently all of the men took turns hitting Shawn in the chest to try and see if it would stop his heart, or maybe just cause some catastrophic damage to his chest where it would kill him anyway. But this wasn't working, so they shoved Maritza and Shawn back into the boot of the car. By the way, I'm like constantly saying boot of the car. I hope that everyone knows that we say boot in South Africa, but it's like the trunk where you put your luggage or shopping, whatever you put in the boot of the car. But anyway, so around 30 minutes after they've just beaten up Shawn, Maritza's crying, they stop again. And these 5 guys now stopped on like the edge of the cliff where you kind of overlook to see the view. They stopped there. They took Shawn out of the car. I'm not sure if Maritza was also out of the car, or she was standing, or she was sitting looking in the boot. But Shawn was the one who was dragged out of the car and beaten again, especially in the face. And then when their fists got really sore, they decided to then hit his face against a tree. So they would like hold his hair and then like hit his face into the tree. They also tried to strangle Shawn, but this was taking too long and it was frustrating the men, so they decided to try another way of trying to kill Shawn. And that was, they took 2 plastic bags and they put a plastic bag over Shawn's face. They also took a plastic bag and put it over Maritza's face. But not only that, they also used the duct tape to tie their hands together, and they duct taped their face as well with the plastic bag over it. So obviously Maritza and Shawn were really, really struggling to breathe. But they were still alive or moving enough, so they put them back in the boot and they decided to drive off again. But then they decided to drive the Bainskloof Pass. And if you've ever seen the Bainskloof Pass, it's really, really high. Basically, if you are on the Bainskloof Pass and you're at kind of like the crest or the top of the pass, you are very high up. There's no railings, it's just old school rocks. So the pass hasn't really been modified since it was made like 100 and something years ago. So these men now got out of the car with Shawn and Maritza still in the boot on top of this Bainskloof Pass. They then took this leather jacket off Shawn, and they took the sound system which Shawn had worked so hard to get, and they then put it in their car. And what happened next was these men decided then to keep Maritza and Shawn in the boot of the car. They locked the boot and they then proceeded to push this car off the cliff of the side of Bainskloof. Sadly, when this boot went over the cliff of Bainskloof, the boot ended up opening and Maritza and Shawn were flung out of the car. They continued then to hit the rocks and the ground just as the car did as well. So to this day, we are not sure whether Maritza and Shawn were conscious at the time that they were flung out of the boot, or if they were conscious and they experienced every single hit when they were going down the cliff of Bainskloof. But the cause of death of Shawn and Maritza was determined to be suffocation. But sadly, that is what happened to Shawn and Maritza. Obviously, Shawn and Maritza's parents were really worried about what was happening to them. Both families did not sleep very well that night. And the next morning, they were even more worried because they thought, okay, maybe there's hope that they slept at this person's house and they just didn't let anyone know. Then on the 24th of April, when their children still did not return home, they decided to go around the areas where they thought Shawn and Maritza may have gone. But they didn't travel as far out as Bainskloof because remember, Shawn and Maritza stayed in Malmesbury. So they didn't find Shawn and Maritza and they ended up calling the police. So over the next couple of days, police did end up doing investigations, going from door to door, asking if anyone had seen Maritza or Shawn. But a couple of days after this terrible incident happened, a car driving over Bainskloof noticed that a couple of big boulders were missing from the side of the barrier. So they stopped, they looked over, and they did see a car that had been crushed in the embankment down the valley of Bainskloof. So while police were at the crime scene, they did notice Shawn and Maritza's bodies quite close together. They had terrible bruising over their faces and bodies. Their clothes had also been ripped quite severely. Now, as just pure coincidence, Maritza's uncle was actually a police officer at the time. He happened to only hear that the car had been found at Bainskloof because he was busy going to different jurisdictions asking about Maritza if anyone had seen it. And while he was in a police station near Bainskloof, he had then overheard police officers talking about a car that was found in like the ravine or the valley of Bainskloof. The police also mentioned that there were 2 bodies, so Maritza's uncle just thought that this was very suspicious and he went down to Bainskloof to have a look. After these 5 men decided to do this horrific crime to Maritza and Shawn, they actually split up. They didn't want to get caught like most criminals, I assume. But they split up and they went back to their families in different kind of like little towns around the Western Cape. And they just kind of laid low for a little while. So a task team was set up to investigate the murder of Maritza and Shawn. But sadly, police were pulled into so many different directions because in small towns, sadly, gossip spreads really quickly. And people were spreading rumors that there was like a love triangle and that someone had murdered them because of this. Then while police were doing their rounds and talking to different people around the area, a witness that they happened to knock on her door came forward saying that she did see the couple that night. And she also said that she saw the car with many men in that night. And she could give an accurate description of who was walking towards Shawn and Maritza's car at the time. And police obviously loved this. They were very intrigued by this, but without names. And this, these towns were not that small that you could exactly point out who was who. So they were kind of stuck, and the case went cold for a couple of weeks. Then these men clearly could not stay out of trouble, and they decided to ask one of their friends to spray paint their car a different color, as well as to change the number plates of the car. And now that police were kind of focusing on the Malmesbury area only, and they had different suspects, they thought that they were in the clear. So they decided to rob more people in Malmesbury, and they decided to hone in on a particular bar. And one of the guys who was in this group said that they often went to this bar and they were tired of spending so much money here and drinking there, and they wanted their money back for all the times and money that they spent there. Then don't go to the bar if you don't want to spend the money there. But anyway, so now these guys decided to rob this bar. And they were going to do it late Saturday night, or technically early Sunday morning, when the bar was closing, but the bar was full of cash. So the guys rocked up, and one of them even had the audacity to wear Shawn's leather jacket the night of this robbery. The guys then pretended to play pool, they drank, and they just kind of socialized until things started to quieten down, and they were the only people left in the bar. Then, when they were the only people left in the bar, they called over the bar manager and said, listen, I can't get my money or my R2 out of this like pool thing. Can you come help me? So the bar manager walks over to this pool table, and he's kind of bending over to see why the money's stuck in the pool table. And one of the guys kind of hit him over the back of the neck here with a gun. And the first instinct of this manager is to like kind of defend himself, obviously. And he's now struggling with one of these guys. And then while he's struggling, someone else then takes a knife and slits the manager's throat. And now they think that this manager's dead. They're super chuffed with themselves. This manager's lying in a pool of his blood, and they're like, oh, cool. We managed to get away with money now. We killed other people, like a happy day. So after now killing the manager of the bar, they assumed, they walked over to the till and they managed to grab 26,000 Rand cash from this bar. That's a lot of money. And then they decided to kind of walk back to the pool table, and they were just having a fat chat about how happy they were about all of these murders. And they were talking about Maritza and Shawn, and they were talking about the other robberies that they had done, and they were just really happy with themselves. But little did they know that the manager that they thought that they killed or slit his throat, he was actually still alive, and he was listening to everything that they were saying. But obviously this manager was in some bad shape. He was not exactly thriving on the floor. So the manager was taken to hospital eventually the next day, and he was put in a induced coma so that his body could recover. Then 2 of the men were arrested for different charges, and while the police were actually looking into these 2 men that they just arrested out of the 5, they happened to look at one of the guy's cars. And the police became suspicious when they were looking at the car and they noticed the leather jacket. And one of the cops said, that leather jacket looks really familiar. I'm not sure if I saw it in one of the crime scene photos. We should take it and we should keep it. So they kept the jacket. And they didn't link it to Shawn quite yet, but one of the cops' brains was kind of like ticking over. But the other three were still free, and that was Donovan, Ricardo, and Percy. And now, like I said, these guys clearly cannot stay out of trouble. But Donovan, Ricardo, and Percy decided to rob someone else, and that was a coffee shop in Worcester, I think it was. And they managed to rob this coffee shop. They didn't walk away with much money. I think it was less than 2,000 Rand, so they were not very happy with that. And they decided, okay, Worcester is maybe getting a bit crowded. The police are going to be swarming all over here, so we need to get out of Worcester and go back to Ceres. So Donovan, Percy, and Ricardo decided to get back in the car, and they were going to head back to Ceres. And I'm not sure if it was maybe one of the guys who were actually in prison already, but an anonymous tip came into the police to say that the person who killed Maritza and Shawn is driving back from Worcester to Ceres. So you would maybe want to have a look out for that. So police then set up a roadblock, and they actually caught the three men, and they were arrested and taken into custody. All of the men were then linked to each other because they started tittle-tailing on each other, and they were taken to trial for the murders of Shawn Lategan and Maritza van der Merwe. And while they were in trial, Ricardo actually sang like a canary. He was tittle-tailing on everybody. He said everything from start to finish, what happened, who was the mastermind. He also said that Shawn and Maritza were completely aware of what was happening to them the entire night because the guys didn't keep anything a secret. They just said exactly what they were going to do, how they were going to torture them the entire night to them. They also said that when Shawn was close to death, they said that he asked if they could just spare Maritza and just continue with him. But Maritza said, no, if Shawn goes, I go. And they were just all too happy to oblige. But in the end, Ricardo Footy was sentenced to 40 years, and all four other men were sentenced to life sentences. And I think what incredibly mean individuals who were just looking for trouble. It really reminds me of the Hannah Cornelius case that happened in Stellenbosch a couple of years ago, which is traumatizing to say the least. Let me know if you want me to cover that, but it's just kind of the same concept of wrong place, wrong time, and how that can significantly affect your life here in South Africa. And by the way, just a side note, remember the cop Andrew April who was suspended? He actually got parole and he's out today. He's no longer in prison. I just think that it's terrible that he actually got parole. But like I said, that is the story and that is this terrible case. But I hope that you were entertained by this case. Please stay safe out there and please don't go talking to too many strangers. See you again next week. Bye.